5 men drove to a basketball game on a winter night in 1978. 4 were found months later in impossible locations. 1 was never found at all. This is a true story, and what happened on that mountain road defies every logical explanation investigators could offer. Welcome back to the Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross, and tonight we're opening a case that's been compared to Russia's infamous Dyatlov Pass incident, not because of where it happened, but because of what these men did after they vanished. The choices they made, the places their bodies were discovered, the man who simply disappeared into the California wilderness and was never seen again. This is the story of the Yuba County 5. And I promise you, by the end of this file you'll understand why some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be remembered. February 24th, 1978. Yuba City, California. A small agricultural community in the northern Sacramento Valley, where everyone knows everyone. And Friday nights mean high school football and Saturday mornings mean Little League. It's the kind of place where people don't lock their doors, where a missing person isn't just a statistic, it's your neighbor's son. That evening, 5 young men gathered to do what they loved most: watch basketball. Jack Madruga, 30 years old, was behind the wheel of his prized 1969 Mercury Montego, a car he maintained meticulously, a car he trusted no one else to drive. Beside him sat Ted Weiher, 32, who worked a steady job despite his intellectual challenges. In the back, Bill Sterling, 29, Jack's close friend, Jack Hewitt, 24, the quietest of the group, and Gary Mathias, 25, an Army veteran with a complicated past. These men weren't strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were friends, real friends. They played on the same basketball team, part of a local program that gave them structure, community, purpose. They had jobs. They had families who loved them. They had plans for the next morning, a Special Olympics basketball game they'd been preparing for, uniforms already laid out at home, excitement building for weeks. They were vulnerable, yes. Each carried diagnoses that marked them as different in a world that doesn't always make space for difference. But they were not helpless. They were not children. And what happened to them that night cannot be explained away by their disabilities alone. The drive to Chico was 50 miles, a straight shot through the valley on highways they'd traveled before. The basketball game at California State University, Chico, ended around 10 o'clock. Witnesses saw them at a convenience store shortly after, buying snacks and drinks for the ride home, candy bars, soda, the small comforts of a good night out. They left that parking lot, 5 friends in a reliable car on familiar roads with every reason to go home. They had a game in the morning. They had people waiting for them. They had a route so simple that getting lost should have been impossible. They should have been home by 11. They never arrived. And here's where this story stops making sense. Because the Mercury Montego didn't break down on the highway. It didn't veer off the road in the valley. It didn't end up anywhere close to where it should have been. Instead, that car traveled over 70 miles in the wrong direction, climbing out of the valley, ascending thousands of feet in elevation, winding up a remote mountain road called the Oroville-Quincy Highway, deep into Plumas National Forest at 4,400 feet above sea level. Let me be clear about something. This wasn't a wrong turn. This wasn't missing an exit. You don't accidentally end up on that mountain road when you're driving from Chico to Yuba City. You have to deliberately leave the valley floor. You have to ignore every sign, every instinct, every piece of common sense that says you're going the wrong way. One family member who knew the area would later emphasize this point. You can't possibly just accidentally get there. You have to go way out of your way. So why did they go? Was it panic, confusion? Were they running from something, running towards something? Did someone force them? Did they see something that night that made them believe the mountain road was their only option? We don't know. The men never called home. They never stopped for directions. The maps were still in the glove compartment when the car was found. Whatever led them up that mountain, it wasn't written down. It wasn't explained. It was a decision made in the dark, by men who would never get the chance to tell us why. Bill Sterling's mother, Juanita, woke at 2 in the morning to find her son missing. She knew immediately something was wrong. Bill always came home. When morning arrived and there was still no word, no phone call, no knock at the door, no sign of the 5 men, families began to panic. But the official response was slower than it should have been. Families were told to wait 24 hours before filing a missing persons report. Standard procedure, they said. People turn up, don't worry yet. But these weren't typical missing persons. These were men with known vulnerabilities, men whose routines were predictable, men who had every reason to come home and no reason to vanish. The delay would cost time they didn't have. On February 25th, a U.S. Forest Service ranger on patrol spotted a Mercury Montego abandoned on the mountain road, stuck in a snowdrift. But without a be-on-the-lookout alert, without any notification that 5 men were missing, the ranger assumed it was just another vehicle belonging to winter visitors. Cross-country skiers, maybe. Snowmobilers. People who'd come back for it later. He drove past. 3 days later, on February 28th, that same ranger saw the missing persons bulletin, and he realized what he'd seen. The Mercury Montego was still there, still stuck in the snow, still empty. When authorities finally reached the car and examined it, nothing made sense. The engine started immediately when hot-wired. The gas tank held a quarter tank of fuel. The snow around the tires wasn't deeply packed. 5 able-bodied men should have been able to push it free without extraordinary effort. Tire spin marks indicated the car had been stuck, yes, but not hopelessly so. Most striking of all, the undercarriage bore no scrapes, no gouges, no damage whatsoever. This was a rough mountain road, unpaved and rocky, yet the Mercury showed no signs of rough driving. It had been driven carefully, deliberately, by someone who knew what they were doing. The keys were missing from the ignition. They would later be found in Jack Madruga's pocket, suggesting he had been the one driving, consistent with his refusal to let anyone else behind the wheel. Inside the car lay the game program, the ticket stubs, candy wrappers, maps still tucked in the glove compartment, untouched, unused. And here's where the investigation made its first catastrophic mistake. Butte County authorities, who had jurisdiction over the vehicle recovery, did not process the Mercury as a crime scene. No fingerprints were taken, no trace evidence collected, no systematic effort to determine who had been in that car, who had touched the steering wheel, whether anyone unknown had been present. For a vehicle that could hold answers to 5 missing men, this was an unforgivable oversight. In their defense, this was 1978, before DNA analysis, before modern forensic protocols, before missing persons cases were automatically treated with the urgency they deserved. But the damage was done. Whatever evidence that car might have held was lost forever. If you're listening to this and feeling that creeping sense of dread, that awareness that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong here, then you understand why this case has haunted investigators for nearly 50 years, because we're just getting started. And if stories like this keep you awake at night, if you find yourself drawn to the questions that have no easy answers, then subscribe to the Midnight File, because the next case might be the one that stays with you longest. Now, there was one witness, one person who might have seen what happened on that mountain road in the early hours of February 25th. His name was Joseph Shones, a man from nearby Berry Creek, and his story is as confusing as it is critical. According to Shones, he had driven up that same mountain road late on the night of February 24th and became stuck in the snow approximately 150 feet from where the Mercury would later be found. While attempting to free his vehicle, he began experiencing symptoms he believed indicated a heart attack, chest pain, shortness of breath, the unmistakable sensation that something was very wrong. He retreated to his car and waited in the darkness. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, Shones claimed he saw activity around the area where the Mercury was stuck. He saw people. He heard sounds. When he called out for help, those people went silent. Flashlights that had been visible suddenly went dark. He claimed to have seen a pickup truck, red or rust-colored, though he would later say authorities had suggested that color to him, and he'd simply agreed. But here's the problem. Joseph Shones' story changed, repeatedly. The number of people he claimed to see ranged from 2 to as many as 12. In some versions, he witnessed activity around the abandoned Mercury. In others, told directly to family members, he described being tailgated up the mountain by another vehicle, a completely different narrative from what appeared in police reports. Context matters here. Shones was intoxicated that night. He was experiencing a medical emergency. He was, by multiple accounts, not mentally stable during his observations. And yet his testimony remains the only first-hand account of what might have happened on that mountain road. Did he see the 5 men abandoning the Mercury? Did he see someone else, someone who had forced them there, someone who meant them harm? Or did he see nothing at all, his oxygen-deprived brain conjuring phantoms in the snowy darkness? We don't know. And Shones is no longer alive to clarify. What we do know is this. At some point after the car was abandoned, the 5 men left the Mercury and began walking. Not down the mountain toward civilization, not back toward the valley where help was waiting. They walked up, higher into the mountains, deeper into the wilderness. 19 miles through snow and ice and brutal February cold, they walked. 19 miles in inadequate clothing, without proper winter gear, without food or water or any clear destination. Some researchers believe they followed snowcat tracks left by a Forest Service maintenance vehicle that had cleared the road the previous day. Perhaps those tracks represented the only visible path through the snow. Perhaps the men believed those tracks would lead to shelter, to safety, to a ranger station or cabin where they could call for help. But the journey was punishing, the kind of trek that would test experienced mountaineers, let alone 5 men unprepared for winter survival. 2 of them didn't make it. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling, best friends inseparable in life, were found together approximately 4.5 miles from where the car was abandoned. Their remains were heavily decomposed, discovered only after the spring thaw months later. Police theorized that one collapsed first, succumbing to the final stages of hypothermia, that strange, paradoxical sensation where your freezing body suddenly feels unbearably hot, where victims strip off their clothes and lie down in the snow convinced they're overheating. And the other refused to leave him, refused to abandon his friend, stayed with him in the snow until the cold took him too. It's one of the few moments in this case where the narrative makes sense, where human behavior aligns with what we'd expect, what we'd hope for. Friendship, loyalty, the refusal to die alone. But the other 3 kept walking. On June 4th, 1978, after the snow had melted and the higher elevations became accessible again, a group of motorcyclists discovered a Forest Service trailer at a place called Daniel Zinc Campground. They noticed a broken front window. When they opened the door, the smell hit them immediately. Inside, on a bunk bed carefully wrapped in 8 sheets and blankets, was the body of Ted Weiher. Let me tell you what the autopsy revealed, because this is where the case stops being a tragic story of men lost in the wilderness and becomes something far more disturbing. Ted Weiher's feet were severely frostbitten, nearly gangrenous. The tissue had died, blackened, the kind of injury that causes excruciating, unrelenting pain with every movement. His body had wasted away. Analysis suggested he'd lost nearly half his normal weight of 200 pounds. Starvation. Slow, agonizing starvation. His beard growth told investigators how long he'd been alive in that trailer. 8 to 13 weeks. From late February into May. 8 to 13 weeks, let that sink in. Ted Weiher survived in that trailer, alone or with others who eventually left, for up to 3 months. While search teams looked for him, while his family prayed for his return, while spring arrived and the snow melted and the world moved on, and he starved. Now here's the part that makes no sense, the part that turns this from tragedy into mystery. That trailer was fully stocked. Outside in a storage locker, enough dehydrated and canned food to sustain 5 men for more than a year. Sea rations, canned goods, provisions meant for Forest Service workers who might need emergency supplies during winter patrols. Some of the sea ration cans had been opened, their contents consumed. So someone, Ted or possibly Gary or someone else, knew the food was there, knew how to access it, had eaten some of it. But the vast majority remained untouched. A large propane heating tank sat outside, connected to the trailer, capable of providing warmth through the coldest nights. It was never activated. Heavy forestry clothing hung inside, coats, boots, gear designed for winter survival. Unworn, books, matches, firewood, everything needed to start a fire in the fireplace and combat the killing cold. No fire was ever lit. Ted Weiher died in a fully stocked survival shelter, surrounded by everything he needed to live, and he starved. Why? That's the question that haunts everyone who studies this case, and the answers offered are all deeply unsettling. Some researchers suggest learned helplessness, that if Ted and the others experienced violence or terror that night, if they witnessed something that shattered their sense of safety, they might have shut down psychologically. Trauma does that. It can paralyze you. It can make you incapable of the most basic survival instincts, even as your body slowly fails. Others point to cognitive limitations. Ted Weiher's intellectual disability might have prevented him from understanding how to reconstitute dehydrated food, how to operate the heating system, how to problem-solve in ways that would have saved his life. He might have believed taking the supplies without permission was theft and refused on moral grounds, even as he starved. There's another theory, one that's harder to voice, one that suggests Ted wasn't alone in that trailer for the entire duration, that Gary Mathias, the veteran with military training and survival skills, was with him. And that something went wrong, very wrong. If Gary was experiencing a psychiatric crisis, if he'd gone off his medication, if paranoia or delusion had taken hold, he might have controlled access to the supplies. He might have believed that using the heat or the food would give away their location, that someone was hunting them, that staying cold and hidden was the only way to survive, and Ted, vulnerable and dependent, might have obeyed. If you're feeling uncomfortable right now, if this story is starting to affect you, good. That means you're paying attention. That means you understand what's at stake when we tell these stories. We're not here for entertainment. We're here because these men deserve to be remembered, because the truth matters even when it's incomplete. If that resonates with you, leave a comment. Tell me what you think happened on that mountain. Share this video with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. Because these conversations, these collective efforts to understand the incomprehensible, that's how we honor the lost. Jack Hewitt's remains were found on June 7th, approximately 2 miles northeast of the trailer, beneath a manzanita bush. Just bones by that point. His shoes and jeans lay nearby, removed or shed in the final confusion of hypothermia. Investigators theorized that Jack had been in the trailer with Ted when Ted passed away, and when Jack, who had the most severe cognitive limitations of the group, realized his companion was gone, he panicked. He fled into the wilderness, running from the one place that might have kept him alive, directly into the forest, where exposure would inevitably claim him. 4 men accounted for, 4 deaths that make a kind of terrible sense, even if the circumstances don't. But the 5th man was never found. Gary Mathias, 25 years old Army veteran, the one with military training and survival skills, the one who'd once escaped a psychiatric facility by crawling through a drainage pipe, then walked and hitchhiked 80 miles to get home. The one who'd reportedly survived alone in the wilderness before, eating what he could find, stealing milk, enduring conditions that would break most people. His tennis shoes were discovered inside the trailer, removed apparently so he could wear Ted Weiher's leather shoes. Weiher's feet were larger, and Gary's feet would have been swollen from frostbite, making the larger shoes necessary. So he left the trailer. At some point, for some reason, Gary Mathias walked away from the only shelter for miles, and he vanished. Where did he go? Why did he leave? How long did he survive out there in those vast, unforgiving forests? Some believe he went for help, that he realized Ted was dying, that the situation was hopeless, and he made a desperate attempt to reach civilization and bring back rescuers. But the terrain was brutal, the distances too great. If he was injured, if he was weak from weeks of inadequate food and freezing temperatures, he might have collapsed anywhere in thousands of acres of wilderness. Others have speculated something darker, that Gary, in the grip of mental illness, believed he was being pursued. That paranoia drove him deeper into the forest, convinced that staying still meant being caught. That he's still out there somehow, living off the land, avoiding detection because his psychiatric history might draw unwanted attention. Or maybe he simply succumbed to the elements at some unknown location. His body never recovered, his final resting place known only to the forest itself. Gary Mathias is the ghost at the center of this mystery, the missing piece, the man whose absence raises more questions than his presence ever could have answered. Now let's talk about what went wrong with the investigation. Because this case wasn't just a tragedy of circumstances, It was a failure of institutions. 3 counties held jurisdiction over different aspects of the case. Yuba County, where the men lived, where families first reported them missing. Butte County, where the mercury was found. Plumas County, where the trailer and the remains were eventually discovered. But no unified command structure existed. No single investigator held authority across all 3 jurisdictions. No joint task force coordinated efforts. No intelligence cell collated tips and pushed resources toward the most promising leads. Information traveled by telephone and paper memo. A deputy in one county might receive critical information and have no mechanism to share it with investigators in another. Tips could vanish into file cabinets. Leads could die silently, unexamined, unfollowed. And here's the most heartbreaking failure of all. According to police records, 2 Forest Service workers allegedly reported to Butte County authorities, sometime in late February or early March, that a Forest Service trailer existed at Daniel Zinc Campground. If that report was made, if it was logged, if it was shared with the search teams looking for 5 missing men, they could have reached that trailer while Ted Weiher was still alive. 8 to 13 weeks. That's how long he survived. Plenty of time for a rescue, plenty of time to save him, but there's no evidence the tip was ever acted upon, no record that it reached the right people at the right time. In 1978, before integrated records management systems, before computer-aided dispatch-linked jurisdictions, a piece of information could simply disappear, and a man could die waiting for help that never came. By the mid-1980s, programs like VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, would create national databases specifically to prevent this kind of failure, to ensure that information shared in one jurisdiction would automatically alert others, that patterns would be recognized, that tips wouldn't vanish. But in 1978, the Yuba County 5 fell through the cracks of a fractured system, and the consequences were fatal. Now everything I've told you so far could be explained as a tragic accident. Men with vulnerabilities, caught in a winter emergency, making poor decisions under stress, succumbing to exposure in terrain that shows no mercy. But there are those who believe something else happened that night. That the 5 men didn't just get lost, that they encountered something deliberate, something malicious. Let me share the evidence that supports this theory. First, the route itself, the absolute impossibility of accidentally ending up on that mountain road. If the men were forced at gunpoint, if they were fleeing from someone pursuing them, suddenly the inexplicable becomes explicable. Second, Joseph Schoen's witness account, however unreliable. His claim of seeing people flee into darkness when he called out, his mention of a second vehicle, even if his details are confused, even if his mind was unreliable that night, there might be a kernel of truth buried in his testimony. Third, rumors of evidence never publicly explained. Some researchers claim references exist in case files to items found in or near the mercury. A baby blanket, possibly shell casings, that were never reconciled with official findings. Schons allegedly reported hearing sounds that night, sharp cracks that could have been branches breaking or could have been something else entirely. Fourth, the pattern of the remains. If this was a case of foul play followed by escape into the wilderness, the spatial distribution makes sense. The 2 weakest men succumbed first on the path. Ted reached shelter, but was too traumatized or controlled to save himself. Jack fled in panic when Ted passed. Only Gary, with his military training, might have survived longest. Author Tony Wright has spent years investigating this case, culminating in his book, Things Aren't Right. He's conducted extensive interviews, reviewed case files, and developed a theory centered on revenge. Wright suggests someone with military experience and knowledge of the area, possibly a local with a grudge against Gary Mathias, may have confronted the group that night, forced them up the mountain, and left them to perish in the wilderness. The theory proposes that Gary was the target, that the others were simply collateral, that whoever did this knew the terrain, knew the weather, knew that 5 men unprepared for winter survival wouldn't make it out alive, and that the perpetrator walked away, confident the wilderness would erase the evidence. It's a compelling theory. It explains the route. It explains the apparent terror that might have prevented rational behavior. It explains why men with the means to survive chose not to use them, perhaps believing their attacker was still nearby, still watching, still waiting. But here's what argues against it. The autopsies showed no signs of violence, no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no blunt force trauma, no defensive injuries. All 4 recovered men died from exposure and hypothermia, consistent with wilderness survival failure. The mercury showed no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no damage from violence. The interior was orderly, not ransacked or disturbed in the chaos of confrontation. If armed individuals had forced 5 men into that vehicle at gunpoint, you'd expect some indication, some evidence, some sign that resistance occurred, and yet there's nothing, so we're left with 2 possibilities. Either this was a crime so carefully executed that it left no forensic trace, unlikely in 1978, when criminals were less sophisticated about evidence, or this was exactly what it appeared to be, a cascade of poor decisions by vulnerable men in an unforgiving environment. The truth, I suspect, lies somewhere in between. Something happened that night that we don't understand, something that triggered panic or confusion, or a decision that made sense in that moment but appears incomprehensible in hindsight. Maybe they saw something, maybe they heard something. Maybe Gary experienced a psychiatric episode and convinced the others they were being followed, that the mountain road was their only escape route. Maybe someone did approach them with bad intentions, but stopped short of violence, just scared them, just sent them fleeing. We don't know. And nearly 50 years later, we may never know. The families of the Yuba County 5 have lived with this absence for decades now. Mothers who woke in the night expecting to hear their sons come home. Fathers who drove those mountain roads, searching, hoping, praying for answers that never arrived. They've heard the theories, the speculation, the endless questions from researchers and documentarians and people like me who make a living asking why. But theories don't bring closure, speculation doesn't ease grief, and questions just echo in the silence where answers should be. What haunts me most about this case isn't the mystery itself. It's the missed opportunities, the institutional failures that might have saved a life if communication had been better, if jurisdictions had cooperated, if one tip had reached the right desk at the right time. Ted Weiher survived for months in that trailer. Months. While the world searched, while spring arrived, while his family held on to hope. He could have been saved. That's not speculation, that's not theory, that's the documented timeline. 8 to 13 weeks from disappearance to death, plenty of time for rescue if the system had worked the way it should have. And that failure, that preventable tragedy, is perhaps the most disturbing element of this entire case. The Yuba County 5 have become legend now in true crime circles. The American Dyatlov Pass, the mystery of the Forgotten 5, the case that defies explanation. But they weren't legends. They were men. Real men with families who loved them, with routines and friendships and plans for the future. Jack Madruga, who took such pride in his Mercury Montego that he wouldn't let anyone else drive. Ted Weiher, who worked steadily despite his challenges, who once refused to evacuate a fire because he didn't want to miss work. Bill Sterling, inseparable from his best friend, loyal to the end. Jack Hewitt, quiet and gentle, who died alone under a manzanita bush, confused and terrified. Gary Mathias, complicated and troubled and capable, who walked into the forest and was never seen again. They deserved better than this. Better than an unsolved case file gathering dust. Better than becoming a curiosity for people like me to dissect. They deserved answers. If this story has affected you, if you're sitting there in the dark wondering what really happened on that mountain road, then do something with that feeling. Don't let it fade. Don't let these men become just another mystery you heard about once. Share this video. Leave a comment with your theory. Subscribe to this channel so that the next time we open a forgotten file, you'll be there to bear witness. Because that's what we do here at the Midnight File. We remember the forgotten. We ask the questions that have no easy answers. We refuse to let these stories disappear into silence. New research continues. Tony Wright's book has reignited interest. Family members still advocate for renewed investigation, for modern forensic analysis of whatever evidence remains, for one more search through those mountains with better technology and better coordination than existed in 1978. Maybe there's still something to find. Maybe Gary Mathias's remains are out there, waiting to be discovered. Maybe there's a witness who saw something that night and stayed silent all these years. Maybe someone knows what happened and has carried that knowledge like a stone in their chest for 5 decades. Or maybe the forest has already claimed all its secrets. Maybe the answers died with those 5 men on a February night in 1978. Maybe we're looking for meaning in a story that has none, just randomness and bad luck, and the brutal indifference of nature. I don't know which possibility disturbs me more. Every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others. Yuba County buried 5 men in its mountains, and the truth went with them. On quiet nights when the wind moves through Plumas National Forest, when snow begins to fall on those mountain roads, I wonder if their story is truly over, or if it's still being written somewhere out there in the dark, in a place we haven't looked yet. The file remains open, the questions remain unanswered, and 5 men who left for a basketball game on a winter night in 1978 remain unfound, unexplained, unforgotten. This has been The Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross, and some mysteries don't get solved. They get survived. By the families left behind, by the investigators who couldn't save them, by those of us who refuse to let them be forgotten. Sleep well, if you can,